anymore. Alright, Diallas boys, easy peasy. Hey, what is up guys, JTX here. This is going to be the updated 3.23 League Start version of Bleedbow Gladiator. Probably saw Jungron run this build to get both of his watchstones. A lot of people have been interested in starting Bleedbow Glad, so here is just a follow-up video from the last League's League Starter. There's not too much that's changed actually in the build. This is just more of an updated version with some lessons learned from last League, as well as a couple of skill gem tweaks. In particularly, we're slotting in Volatility now as one of our final endgame 6 links for both our clearing and our single target setup. We'll also cover the secondary ascendancy choices from the Affliction League mechanic. I have a whole note section here that's been updated from 3.22 to 3.23, so this will be where to get all the gems and also what your links should look like as you go out throughout the acts. I also have leveling trees included in this PoB, so you can follow along to see how the build actually progresses. I've made a few changes in the PoB itself. Notably, in our early game now, before we get our full 100% suppression, we go for Entrench over here and get some extra life nodes here. This is just to give us access to the spell suppression mastery, so chance to suppress spell damage is lucky. This gives us a little bit of spell suppression early on as we get to early maps without having to require too much on our gear, and also before we swap into Magebane and getting reflexes up here. We also grab Cannibalistic right here for a bit of extra damage. We're dropping the Dirty Techniques here. It doesn't have a dot multi on it anymore. It just makes your bleeds deal damage a little bit faster, and there's a lot of points to travel down there. So we don't grab this in the new version of the tree. The tree itself is very largely unchanged as we go throughout the trees from level 1 all the way up to our endgame setup. Our ascendancies, once again, we go Blood in the Eyes first, Gratuitous Violence, Arena Challenger, and then Outmatch and Outlast. I'll quickly talk about the secondary ascendancies. We do want to grab Oath of the Magi early as a Warden if we get a chance while leveling. It gives us 30% increased movement speed on our boots if we have no soft-plated gems in it, so that's really powerful for our boots, and 50% additional elemental resistances if your helmet doesn't have any gems. Obviously, that might make your build a little bit socket starved, so don't go crazy with this type of ascendancy. Make sure you still have your utility gems and your core gems set up, but you can be a little bit flexible in how you want to get either movement speed or more resistances where necessary while leveling. Once we actually get to the end game and we get to mapping, we obviously want to run Howl of the Wolf because we're running Coat of Arms, so our war cries are instant. This is really powerful to give us extra loot from chests and also from corpses. And also we get Might of the Bear here, which gives us a Wildwood Rucksack, which has 20 inventory slots. Really good for mapping. I don't think there's many secondary ascendancies that's going to be better than this single node right here. This single node is just pretty much more inventory space, which is invaluable. This also doesn't include all the bonus benefits we can get from charm sockets, so make sure you check the vendor if there's any cool charms that they're selling. This could be really powerful already on top of Might of the Bear and Howl of the Wolf. I would recommend going those as our secondary ascendancies as you run this character. For the actual skill gem changes for Puncture and Split Arrow, really good news for us. Puncture has received a buff which gives it 20% more damage, and Split Arrow gets additional projectiles. Both of them really good for our builds, just pretty much straight up better all around. Snipe also gets an additional extra stage. If we actually factor in these changes into the actual calculations here, if we remove this and we add it back in, we're getting around 33% extra damage with those two changes. Really powerful for the build. This build has already been my league starter for 2 leagues now in a row. It was already very decent in Trial of the Ancestors, and I think it's even better now in Affliction. If you do want to start this build, I think you'll have a very good time. You just have to understand the mechanics of the Snipe, which is a channeling skill. Some people might find it a bit clunky, so that's a disclaimer. You do have to get used to the playstyle a little bit to maximize the potential of Bleedbow. I only really covered the changes to the actual build in this video. The majority of the content I've already touched upon last league in the other video. Please check that video out if you're interested in how the build actually works, how Mana Force Arrow works, how Snaring Arrow works. All of that's already covered in a previous video I've done. This is just purely to cover the changes to 3.23 Affliction League. I think this build is going to be even stronger than it was last league, and it was already very decent for me as a league starter. I think you guys will have a really great time with this build. This PoB will include different sets of gears from early mapping into endgame mapping, as well as your swap into suppression gear and endgame gear. It also will include all the trees from level 1 all the way until you swap to your final cluster setups. It also has skill gems from when you start off early mapping into endgame mapping as you get all your auras online. Pretty much this will cover everything from level 1 all the way up into the very late endgame. I started this build for Total League and it took me all the way until my 4 Watchstones. I also did a lot of the invitations, including the Fiat on this build. Bleed explosions are always really strong against a lot of different types of mechanics, so I think this build will do pretty well as a league starter, especially for the clearing aspect, and our single target aspect has been juiced up thanks to the gems. For leveling, Act 1 you're using a split arrow with chance to bleed and pierce. Then when you get to Act 2, I prefer to use a rain of arrow setup with chance to bleed, vicious proj, whatever colors you can find you can slot in. I think this is entirely player preference, whether you want to use rain of arrows or split arrow. Both of them are very good for leveling. You do eventually switch into split arrow anyway at Act 8 once you get gratuitous violence, which is your bleed explosions. I just generally prefer rain of arrows for the leveling experience because you don't really have to aim and you don't have to run a clearing support like pierce or chain on it early on. And it was really nice not really having to think about where you want to aim your attacks. Other than that, if you just follow along with the notes here, it'll tell you all the gems that you need for the build, including auras and utility, and what acts you can grab them and pick them up. The playstyle itself is pretty straightforward. You're just going to be hitting enemies with a puncture / snipe setup for single targets and using your rain of arrows or split arrow to clear everything around it. Make sure that you keep reapplying your snipe puncture, especially if you do end up running volatility. Volatility is very powerful if you're able to apply the puncture 2 or 3 times in a fight, simply because you're trying to fish for a higher bleed. Volatility makes the range that you roll from very low to very high. So when you do shoot multiple times, you're trying to fish for the really high bleed. Your highest bleed is the one that stays on the target. If you hit a target with a lower bleed, it's not going to override your higher bleed. Just some general information about how bleed works itself. You can't have more than 1 bleed on enemy unless you run Crimson Dance, but with this build, you wouldn't. Just another call out I didn't mention in the original video. We do grab Cold War Arms very early in the leveling experience, and we take that all the way to the end game. Enduring Cry is very powerful for the build as it generates endurance charges, and also with the new secondary Ascendancy, it also allows us to open chests and also shake corpses for additional loot. So really powerful node for our build and makes the build playstyle a lot better. I'll quickly go over the configs and the stats for the build. Sitting with just our early mapping gear, so this is just capping our resistances and a bit of life on our gear. We have about 30k effective hit pool with Molten Shell up. Without Molten Shell up, it's still about 20k. Sitting about 2.9 million bleed DPS, which is very respectable for early game gear. If you look at the gear here, it's very easily obtainable in the very first day of the league. I think this damage is more than enough to take you all the way into red maps, and then as you do get into endgame, you'll start progressing your gear and your damage will start ramping up for each piece of gear you pick up. Notably, getting your Slathis is really important early on. It's best in slot for this build. Outside of Mage Blood, it's really powerful in terms of adding damage to our build, so highly recommend you guys grab that as soon as you can. There are a few other uniques that you can also grab if you want to improve your mapping experience. Last league, I experimented with both Inspired Learning and a Death Rush for endgame mapping. Those are really powerful items to increase your endgame experience, especially if you're fighting very juiced content. I think 1 Inspired Learning is very powerful, and you can slot it right here near Juggernaut and Savage Wounds. We already grab all those notes, so it's a no-brainer. If you want to slot in an Inspired Learning, we put it over there. The other alternative I can think of for late game, end game mapping is potentially using our Diallas and our Ashes setup, because the quality gives so much extra value now to our bleed. Not sure if that might be worth it because you're sacrificing a lot of defense and your suppression to get that extra damage in. Normally you will be able to hit pretty close to bleed cap if you build the character correctly and get some decent rare gear everywhere. I think it is an option if you do want to push it, but you do sacrifice a lot on defenses. Interested to see what people will do with new quality of both puncture and split arrow. If you guys have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments below, or find me at twitch.tv/JTX. I'll be streaming the whole entire league start. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask me over there. Hope everyone has a really good league start. I'm looking forward to the new league. I'm sure all you guys are as well. I will see you guys on the beach. Thanks for watching the video, and I will catch you guys in the next one.